waiting for it to wake up and turn on. There we are. All right. So let's begin. I'm going to try uh, two things. My voice may not let me do very much. So hopefully, and I have to take a very good look to see if anybody else is trying to get on. Okay. Because, and let's see what this is. Hello in there. As you can see from my screen, my internet is, for whatever reason, my 5G system is apparently a 10 kilobyte system. That's about the size of it. So why worry about that? All right, moving on. There we go. I was going to send you a presentation, and I'll just keep an eye out and periodically switch back. And again, the voice will be the rate determining step that's here. Here it comes, I think. And this is about where we left off. I was going to do this on Friday, but then I got clobbered. So nevertheless, this is where we are. I'm hopeful to be back on Wednesday. I anticipate, because that's when I have my next lab. I think it's unlikely for me to be there tomorrow. If you need me, holler, text, whatever. So these are just some of the skin things. Skins are reflective. So cyanosis is not a good sign at all, because it means somebody is really very low oxidation. You see this in folks who are in bed shape. It's a real warning sign. So you begin to see a sort of bluish cast. Lips will show it. Fingernails will show it. Not a good sign. Pallor, being very, very pale. Anemia, probably the most common sign it is. And yes, obviously fear and anger. And even low blood pressure. But I think anemia is the most common sign with regard to that. The opposite is erythema. Erythro is obviously the prefix for red. Redness. A lot of different things. Less so with hypertension. But I mean, it's what we look for. It's as we get into the immune system, you're going to see we talk about things. We talk about swelling, and we talk about redness, and we talk about heat. Those are all signs of inflammatory changes. And I think that's probably the most common thing that we see associated with it. And jaundice is very, very specific to indicate that there's a backup somewhere compromising the liver's ability to expel bile, and it backs up effectively into the bloodstream, and you get this classic thing that we call jaundice, or icteric, icteric. It's the classic. Ecchymoses, lots of different times we refer to them. Hematomas, which is more of an accumulation of blood under the skin. That's their ecchymoma, is the classic black and blue mark. They change color as your body metabolizes and breaks down the hemoglobin. And so you begin to see that typical changes that are associated with it. And bruising is such an oddball thing. Some bruise easily, some do not. And here's another one. And for people who treat a lot of diabetes, there are different little signs that they look for in certain things that are there. This may be one of them, as you can see, that are there. Which really, the next two topics, which are hair and nail, is a different kind of keratin. It's really a hard keratin. It's They're what we classify as skin appendages. That makes them very, very similar to skin. Very few areas on your body where you don't have hair. Palms and soles would be the most common. Lips, certainly. Nipples, certainly. Pardon me. Some of the external genitalia. Yeah. I mean, there's all those wonderful hairs are little sensors. Is there a certain, pardon me, physical limit? Does it help guard? Maybe a little bit. Heat loss, I think absolutely. Shielding, I think absolutely. Pili, another term that we use, even though pili we use in micro all the time. And so you're going to see it's a little bit of different. We're not going to go into the chemistry of the difference with hard keratin and its durability and cells, and they don't flake off like our external. They're not shed. We just cut our hair when it gets to a certain point, or else the entire hair sheds. So the hair shaft is effectively dead cells, and it extends above the scalp where keratinization is complete. The root within the scalp is where it's going on, and that is viable tissue. That's why when If you can get hair follicles and you can get a full picture of DNA, where hair in and of itself, you may not, depending on what it is. You may only get mitochondrial DNA, depending on just how viable it is. And just like every other tissue has an outside and inside terms you're going to become very familiar with, we're going to do it with bone, medulla and cortex. Medulla is the central core. Frequently in hair, it has cells that are fairly large, air, sometimes other pigments accumulate in there. The cortex, the outer layer, surrounds it. And then what you begin to see is a cuticle. And we see an analogous structure on nails. Is this outer layer that's somewhat waxy. A cuticle in a fingernail is obviously, or toenail is that bit of skin, or appears to be like skin, but it's a kind of variant of skin that's at the base of it. And the cuticle is so it's similar in that regard. You'll see some of the illustrations. Hair color is very interesting because you have different kind. Not only is the melanin different, there's different kinds of melanin that are part of it. So reddish hair, which perhaps, and again, I would consider that more hereditary than not, and we see it in greater abundance in certain populations. Our British friends have a lot of red-haired folks have this pheomelanin, and when you hear somebody like who has gray hair or patchy hair, there's less melanin, and you get a lot of air in the shaft, and that's one of the ways. It's a good look. So this is an actual micrograph. This is a schematic. You can see in this case, you see the cuticle is within, and the medulla is this inner area in its entirety. And you can see the cuticle, as you point the arrows, is this sort of a waxy section around the medullary area. And then the cortex itself, so medulla on the inside, cortex on the outside, as you can begin to see where they are. It's a little bit hard to distinguish them, and they're pointing to them, as you can see here. Medulla, the cortex on the external portion, as you can see here, the cuticle farther out. And then you can see this layer of basal cells, this internal root sheath, and you can see them beginning to grow and change as they go toward the outside that are there. And to some extent, you can even see growth, I think, also coming from the inside. So there's a lot of growth that occurs with hairs up to a certain period of time. And depending, it can almost be bidirectional in that regard. So as you can see, uh, from the epidermal surface deep into the dermis, plus the hair that's extended, the shaft, the bulb is deep within the follicle, and that's where it expands, as you will see. There are a lot of nerve receptors are there. Scent is really a touch receptor, sensory, so it's almost like a pressure receptor, if you will. You have some dermal derived connective sheath, which is somewhat fibrous. You have different structures that are there. So you have both a dermal sheath and you have an epidermal sheath. So again, there's a lot going on with hair. Same for nail, an important term, matrix. That's where it's growing from. Actively dividing area of the bulb that produces those hair cells. As it makes new cells, it pushes the older one upward. And like I see it, to some extent, it's coming from the core as well as from somewhat from the periphery. And the erector pili is famously that smooth muscle that's attached to the follicle when your hair stands on end. Papillary, remember papillary dermis? Here you have a knot of capillaries that has that sort of a peg and hole look, and that's what they call the hair papilla. So that's where it gets its nutrients from. So here you can see the papillary area. You can see melanocytes accounting for it. You can see that matrix area, and again, it spreads a little bit in all directions. So you're going to get growth going in a lot of directions that are there. Again, here you can see the medullary area, you can see the cortical area, you can see the cuticular area pretty consistently with all of those that are there. So this is where it's very much where it's living. So if they're going to do, for instance, if someone chooses to have a hair transplantation, they're going to take out hair follicles and insert new, they're going to take them from where they're viable and growing, let's say in the back of your head, and move them forward, which a lot of people have done. And with pretty good success. There's a lot of dermatologists who do those procedures that are there. Different kinds of hair. So what do we see in women and in children? Vellus hair. What do we see? Because it's very fine. It really doesn't have a lot of pigmentation. It's difficult to see. Okay. And then you have terminal hairs. That's we all have everywhere. Okay, and again, in the axillary and pubic regions, they begin to grow. Face and neck areas, they begin to grow. Typically at puberty, obviously nutrition and hormones affect it, and they don't grow that terribly fast. So you're looking at something you might get in 10 weeks, say the better part of an inch, if you want to do the math. And 2.58 was always a good number for centimeters for me, and we do lose some hair. And a lot of these, so and frankly, these are the only areas where we really see any androgens produced in women. That's interesting. We'll get to that because we'll eventually, when physiology, we'll look at the companion piece to this, which is the endocrine system and particularly the adrenal glands that are there. And we begin to see that. So polycystic ovary, sometimes you can get people can become hirsuate, which means excessively hairy, or signs of masculinization. So these are rare. Okay. Lack of hair, which typically starts when you're in your 40s. Some people it's a lot earlier, some people it's a lot later, and some people just doesn't happen until extraordinarily late if it does at all. There's a certain X-linked portion of it. There's a certain amount of genetic portion of it. It had male pattern baldness caused by the follicular response to DHT. So that's so there's treatments that are involved in addressing that particular mechanism. So this may be this telogen effluvium. It's a name I'm unfamiliar with. We used to see a condition called alopecia baldness, area baldness. We typically saw it more so in women than in men. Very often did not have a significant origin. The treatment was very much cookbooky, meaning you used a little bit of whatever worked. So it's kind of a recipe. And we typically use topical steroids for that. I saw it a lot when I was on dermatology rounds and as both a student as a resident, and you would see these kinds of things. Certainly drug related antidepressants, a lot of it that we see there, and there's an abundance of folks on antidepressants. And it's interesting, a lot of times the anogenital and the pubic hairs are affected by this, and it can be a concern to somebody, stigmatizing when we do work. They're very uncomfortable with that idea. Chemotherapy is well known, hypothyroidism, certain kinds of diets, all of those pretty obvious. Nails, okay, more scaly in nature. It kind of describes the way they grow. The nail that you feel is basically dead, whether it's at the free edge, which is the tip, all the way back. When it gets to the base under the cuticle, you see an area we call the lunula. And they spelled lunule in here. I don't know why, because it's kind of like a quarter moon or crescent moon shape at the base of your finger and toenails. It's kind of white there, and that's really where the matrix is located, where it's growing from. So the free edge protrudes over the edge of the nail, typically what we trim. The nail plate itself covers it, and that's protective. It's very sensitive. Under the nail, you have a lot of little sensors, particularly for blood pressure and temperature. And then the root itself is really part of that matrix that's there. Okay. The nail bed is an inch. If you would remove that nail, or if you lost a nail from a clunked it and it came off, what's left under there is called a nail bed. Very, very painful. And what will happen is until the nail grows back, it will dry up and harden, kind of look a little bit like a nail. Nail folds, you have them on the sides and in the back. They have fancy names. Eponychium projects onto the surface. We call it the cuticle. The hyponychium under the free edge, if you want. We're not doing a course in nails. I did one. And the coloring thing is very significant. It's a really good window to look inside and see those things. And yeah, they're a big time player for disease. Vitamin deficiency, sometimes we see them called spoon nails. Vascular insufficiency, another good area to look for things like cyanosis or to look for things like uh, jaundice. All of those are reflected because they're relatively transparent in some of those areas. And so here you can see it. And the nail bed, that area that's here, it's almost right on top of the bone. There's very little soft tissue. That's why it hurts so much when you whack a nail, stub a toe, whatever you want to call it. So as you can see, respiratory and thyroid, we see club nails, particularly respiratory. Fungal infections, very common, particularly as folks get older. Here's the spoon nail, iron deficiency, certain vitamin deficiency, Bose lines. If you're if you think of it and you're doing something clinical, if someone comes into you with, you'll see, particularly after they've had like a stroke or a heart attack or a loss of a loved one. If you look close, oh, it's almost like your magic because you can see that kind of line, and then they'll start. Something happened to you a couple of weeks, a month ago, and they'll go, yeah, I was in a terrible accident or lost a loved one. It'll shock you. A lot of times it's reflected in nails. So there's that spoon nail, pretty good picture. And then lastly, with regard to the glands, we have a lot of them, as you can see. They're mostly eccrine, the apicrine glands. And again, I do not think that this is something that was dreamed up. I really think that this is very consistent with the kind of glands we see in the axial and anogenital region. Okay, there's lots of that goes on. Eccrine abundant everywhere, very much regulated by the sympathetic nervous system. Again, mostly water, salts, etc., etc. Some antimicrobial substances, as you can see, that are there. They're showing you the sort of tortuosity, sort of the twisted nature of the secretory cells is pretty consistent when you kind of see the bottom of these. We're getting there. So the apricot if you could collect it, you would see just a little bit thicker. And some folks, and it isn't always hygienic. And it's unfortunate. Some folks are prone to body odor. It's not their doing. They're stuck because they got a predisposition for this kind of thing. That's there. And yes, it can be hygienic, and yes, there can be other things that go along with it. And yeah, I mean, whatever you want to think about that. Modified apicrine glands, mammary glands, and cerumens, which are earwax. It's my belief. I go with that. If you got a hair, you have a sebaceous glands. Directly into the hair follicle, androgens play a role. It's very oily. It's holocrine. It's bactericidal. It softens the hair. Again, varying genetic dispositions give you oily or dry hair. With regard to that, you can't really miss them. They're very distinctive. Yes, that's where sometimes bacteria, because it's an opening where bacteria will get in and lead to acne related problems. And again, more people are prone to that than others. Some are, some not. I was fortunate not. Others were unfortunate with. And give you a little look see at that. So again, inflammation, sebaceous glands, pimples. I think this since they put this book out, they changed this name again. In the microtext, I think they have a new name for it. They love to do that. Propionibacterium, if you did not cover them in micro, are a gram positive non endospore forming rod. And they typically, so we tend to call them uh, diphtheroids because they have a little bit of a look of diphtheria. And so, if it's, whether it's a whitehead or a blackhead, whatever name you want to do with it. Now, cradle cap is something we do see, and it will peel off, and it doesn't necessarily have any long term thing. It's just notable in babies. I'll show you a picture. All the different things that skin does. This is where we get into the physiology. Yes, it's protective. Perspiration for temperature regulation. Sensation, we talked about. Metabolically active. It's an endocrine gland in the sense that it plays a pivotal role in the activation of vitamin D. And we're going to talk about, and this marries into our discussion of osteoporosis in the bone unit because vitamin D is the key player in that because you have to activate vitamin D. Okay. And just looking at text, I apologize. So I lost my train of thought. So protection, body temperature, here's the metabolic function, that's where I was. Vitamin D has to be activated. It's activated in your kidneys, but it's also activated or co-activated in sunlight. So we all need to be out in the sun for a period of time. And you will see, we'll discuss this more. It's a blood reservoir for somewhere between 5 to 10% of your blood. Yes, we get rid of a certain amount of waste products with it that is there. And so it forms a triple barrier, chemical, and they go through different things, but chemically because of the secretions, And the salt itself, physical because it's strong and tough and waterproof, biological because to me it's covered in microorganisms. So you can see the antimicrobials in the skin. We call them defensins, acid mantle, because what happens is the cells break down that phospholipid bilayer. We get kind of different short chain fatty acids that are there that have an acidic kind of property to them. The chemical barrier of melanin is so terribly important for ultraviolet light protection. Again, be notable about that and do a little research if you like the sun onto what are good sunblocks to use and which ones are not. Because to some extent they sell you a bill of goods. There are some of those sunblocks that have a whole subset of problems when you use them excessively. I just tell you, my wife and I are not sun people. She burns, I burn. I get a golfer's tan when I'm playing golf. That's about it. So, what happens is the physical nature, yes, is the stratum corneum. Most water limitation. It is very penetrable by lipid soluble substances. We do a lot clinically with patches. You've all seen them. Sickness patches, smoking patches, because fat soluble medications. We can figure out the rate of absorption easily in different areas of the skin. We do them for pain management. They're all over the place. Very useful. Oleoresins for certain plants, what you and I collectively call poison ivy, because there's subtle differences between different strains of those plants. They have an interesting, it's what we call delayed reaction hypersensitivity, which we'll get to, which is cell mediated. That's why generally those resins take a little while for your immune system to work on them. That's why it's such a good idea if you're out in the woods and you're this time of year when you don't have a lot of protection on and you're in shorts and a t-shirt and whatever, or a tank top. The old story, go home and shower when you get back in. When you're camping, do that right away because you're going to potentially that's when usually you find it. A lot of organic solvents get through. They carry things into you. And not only can they be harmful, but they can be harmful because they carry other stuff in you. Okay? They carry potential harmful things that might be on your skin, a toxin or something like this. Yeah, lead and mercury would be examples of it. The drugs I was just talking about, okay, all those kinds of things. We understand, and some of you don't because you don't have a context for it. But back in the 60s and 70s, actually up until roughly 1994, it was unusual to wear gloves, certainly in an emergency room. You didn't walk in and see your doctor with a mask and a cap. If you're lucky, they had a white coat, okay, or a clinical coat. We didn't wear gloves. We put our hands on top of people who were bleeding, put our hands inside of them if we had to stop the bleeding. That's what we did. I was a student and I was a chemistry major in the lab. We get all sorts of crap on your hands, and we start working with things like DMSO and acetone, bring it right into your skin. I always wonder why I've been around so long. And so the epidermis, part of its biological barrier, as well as the microorganisms, your body's constantly sampling this, activating your immune response, both in the epidermis and the dermis, etc. So there's lots of problems that are there. Heavy metals, a significant problem. Brain damage, a significant problem. Lead, a significant problem. We see less of those in the environment, but if you're in an area where you're not sure, then you should, or you acquire an older home, watch out. A lot of that stuff's in there, and you can get a check to make sure that are there. We don't, there's what's called insensible perspiration. When you're sweating, it's not insensible, you're sweating. So we get rid of about a half a liter of perspiration without noticing it every day. Okay. And if your temperature goes up, vessels will dilate, sweat gland activity will increase. You can put out a whole ton of sensible perspiration as a cooling because as it evaporates, it cools you. Opposite in the cold, they'll constrict, the temperature will drop to slow heat loss. You'll generate heat internally by shivering with regard to your skeletal muscles. So some folks, so I use me again as an example. If I do anything physical, I'm going to start to perspire right away. Just one of those people. Right away. So all those types of things, extra receptors or outside receptors, temperature and touch, free nerve endings, and they just show them to you, same illustration of the skin. Here's the vitamin D nugget. Keratinocytes do play a role protecting you from other things that are problematic. As you can see, they can convert. We'll use 1% hydrocortisone. If you go out to any store, 1% hydrocortisone is great. If you have some minor skin irritation or any kind of a mild rash, abrasion, or something like that, and collagenase, which is now made in addition to its natural portion that was there now, has been very useful for wrinkles. One of my mentors was working with that for wound healing when I studied with him back in 1950 years ago, actually 47 years ago. So here's the 5%. I think it might be closer to 10. That's there. Some of the things we excrete are there. We do a little bit of nitrogenous waste. Yeah, we can lose excessive amounts of water, which brings us to some interesting stuff. And again, the skin cancer one, the nugget of the one that affected Jimmy Buffett and killed him was a Merkel cell carcinoma. We saw the Merkel cell. So there's lots of different problems with skin. Skin cancers affect, on average, 1 out of 5 of us. I am, relatively speaking, confident from me, and I've had my family physician checks out particularly the facial areas when I come in roughly every year. It's been a year and a half. I'm due back in November. And he, or previously she, will check those areas to see. And I said, what about all this stuff on my hair and my scalp? By and large, there were seborrheic keratoses, which are common. But if something looks suspicious, you need to get a dermatological referral. It's that kind of common. Another one, just like nails, another one of those wonderful areas that's very, very reflective. So, skin cancers are common. Burns are certainly common. This is where we do both of these units. I'd rather have had to be able to show you a little bit in the lab, but so much for that. Again, whenever you see the word tumor, don't go, oh my God, you got a tumor. Some tumors are always cancers. They're always malignant. It just depends on where they are. Okay. So the word tumor, if someone says tumor, ask them, is it benign or malignant? The fact that they're benign doesn't mean they're not deadly. Most 90% of brain cancers are benign, but they occupy space, they push against the brain, they damage it. And yet the problem of metastases, or the ability to spread, is a very significant problem. Meta means beyond, stasis means stopped in a location, so they're beyond being stopped. Number one on the hit parade, frequent irritations. So folks who work outside all the time, I've always been at risk more than that. And yes, there are some topical agents I don't know. I used to know a lot about them, not so much anymore. These are the 3 major types. Notice that Merkel cell one not in there. Basal cells. The way I always remembered it we did was basal is not bad. Basal is typically a carcinoma that just requires excision. As long as you take it out and you have it evaluated, it is typically not something you have to worry about spreading, nor does it require any aftercare. The biggest problem is its size and what it may affect cosmetically. Squamous cell is deeper. Is not deeper is the wrong term, is a different layer. So basal cell affects the stratum basalis. Squamous cell affects the stratum spinosum. Because those cells have started to change shape and undergone some alterations, they have a greater tendency to be metastatic, and they do require some type of aftercare. When I say aftercare, it's usually radiation or chemo. And the one diagnosis you do not want to have is right here, melanoma. For years, we called it malignant melanoma. We don't even have to bother. They're all cancerous. So there's no such thing as a benign melanoma. But you might say, because you hear this a lot. Oh, the doctor said I had skin cancer. He could have something, nothing to worry about. Most likely it was a basal cell. Versus this is significant. Maybe before your time. See them on TV all the time. We're not talking about the Steelers today. Good thing I was sick. I couldn't respond, and the TV set is still intact. The idea that let me sort of rephrase it, is that it's someone you know is going to be have trouble with melanoma. We've done a lot of research, and a lot of the basis of immunotherapy came from melanoma. The researcher whose name escapes me at the National Institute of Health started working with melanomas, extracting them, and doing an interesting procedure at the junction where healthy tissue meets cancerous invasive tissue. You have very active white blood cells. He would harvest those, for lack of a better term, supercharge them, grow them in cell cultures, and re-inject them. It was the early days of immunotherapy, trying to put your body in with effectively killer T cells, that which we'll go into, that were very, very useful. So back in the early days when I got the Steelers, their coach, for not the most recent, but the next most recent Super Bowl, you see on TV all the time, Coach Cower, wonderful guy, lived in, when he coached the Steelers, he and his wife had three daughters. They all went to Fox Chapel schools. Their oldest daughter, Megan, was in my daughter's class. If you want to use the term rivals, they were, okay, in the sense that they're both pretty girls and they were both very popular. Okay. Mrs. Cower, Kay, was in school all the time. She did a ton of volunteer work. Everybody loved her. Everybody knew her. So she really was a great mom in that regard. Unfortunately, she succumbed to melanoma. It was one of the reasons I think he retired early, and one of the reasons why he didn't take another job and moved back to North Carolina, where she was from, because he was obviously from around here. So here we are. That's a little anecdote about that. It's absolutely true. He's remarried, yet had some problems with their marriage, but there's nothing new under the sun about that. Okay, least malignant, most common, typically easily cured. That is one on the nose. You can see it. Squamous, next most common. It's an order of appearance. And keratinocytes of the stratum spinosum, a little, and typically almost always exposed area. Prognosis is good if you get it relatively early and remove it, but they're going to cover it. You can see it just doesn't look as it looks like it's moving places. And melanoma. There's lots of different acronyms you can use. Okay, we used size, shape, color, texture, thickness, all of those things, whatever you want to call it. Highly metastatic, doesn't respond well. Typically, the immunotherapy, as I was commenting on before, is the approach that we have to use. What do you look for in a mole? Well, I got a mole. Okay. What the doctor would look at, if it was me when I go in to see him, is it change shape? Typically, you'll take pictures, you'll put them in the patient's file. You can have them these days available electronically fairly easily, or you can print them out fairly easily, and you measure them. Are the edges irregular? Is it nice and circular and discrete? Does it have a nice border around it? Or do the sides not match? Okay. The borders need to show definition around them, meaning you see the normal appearance of skin wherever you don't see that. Okay. Indentations, never a good thing. Hair growing out of it, okay, because hair growth is normal. Hair growth in an area that had hair growth and hair growth disappears is more circulatory oriented. Color. So when you see something that starts to change color, particularly vividly, and size, certainly. So when you're getting something that's bigger than the eraser on the tip of your pencil, watch out. Most likely it's bad. And the way we grade them is based on depth. There's a lot of criteria. It can do with the skin layer, but basically we look at the biopsy and we see if it is, I mean, if it goes down to the dermis or the deep dermis or subcutaneous, it's a big problem. In subcutaneous, it's a very bad prognosis. So there's another area. It just happens to be on the skin itself. They can be all over. I don't know where Mrs. Cowers was. Which brings us to the nugget on burns. My voice is doing better than I thought. Okay. The nugget on burns, definitely different. Let me see. Hold on, check it in. Ah, thank you. I'm doing great. I appreciate any encouragement is very, very useful. Okay, listen to me. I just want to check to see if we were still going strong, and thank you. as you can tell, I was not ready to come back to class. Let me go back, and we'll try this again at 3 o'clock, and I may get an hour if I'm very lucky. If I'm very lucky, rather, beg your pardon. Ugh, I feel it's a word I don't want to use collectively. Poo poo. Couldn't annoy me. Use my computer, which means just points. Okay, you say it in my own neighborhood. Points. Burns themselves burns can be hot cold. Let's start with that. Are thermal injuries to the skin. It doesn't indicate that they burn by instinct is hot, but it's thermal alteration. Skin can it's protein. It denatures at temperature extremes. The worst complication I saw that killed somebody was from a case of frostbite because their hands became gangrenous and it became a feeding ground for tetanus and they died from tetanus. Why didn't they have a tetanus shot? That was a misdiagnosis when I was a resident. Okay. Did anybody who saw the patient miss the diagnosis that was in there? It happened probably in March before I graduated from my residency. I'm not absolving myself. I didn't think about it. And why wasn't he tetanus current? Because he was a street person. He was a homeless individual that came in when there was a really cold snap. Frostbite occurs mostly in slightly above freezing when people are wet. There's all his fingertips because it was one of those homeless people who had gloves and the fingertips were coming out. We had to amputate the hands. Nobody thought to give him a tetanus shot. Awful reminder I'd never forget again, obviously. Denaturing proteins. So 1 and 1A. The single most important things that happen with a burn are fluid and electrolyte loss, potentially with dehydration or irregularities in electrolytes leading to arrhythmias and things like that. And 2, infections. Burnt skin is comfort food for bacteria. In particular, the bacteria is when you work with in a lab called Pseudomonas aeruginosa. And see, all that is bad. So it all depends on the nature of the burn. They're going to go through first, second, third degree. These days, we talk about full and partial thickness burns. The typical burns that most of us get are partial thickness. The distinction between first and second degree is that they blister. That makes it second degree. It doesn't make it less severe because a bunch of blistering, you lose a lot of fluid. So we look at the rule of nines, and that's a really important thing. So when you see, whether it's in a newspaper article or a TV show, where they're saying, tragic fire, such and such, they sent the 3 people to the burn center with burns over 60% of their body. Did they just look at it? No. There's a way we do it. And there's distinct burn criteria to send somebody to the burn center. Unless it changed, it may have. In my day and age, when I was here in Pittsburgh area, and even when I was practicing out of the area, I was still operating in the Pittsburgh area. So 2 burn centers were Mercy, and it was before it was with UPMC, so it's still a burn center, and the not Shady Side, West Penn. Gotcha. Okay, so how do we do it? We have skin over 11 sections, each for 9%, and the genitalia account for 1. And so it's just an estimate, as you will see. First degree, epidermal only. Doesn't mean it's not painful, doesn't mean it won't swell. Typical sunburn. Distinction if it starts to blister. Damage in the superficial dermis, blisters appear. Partial thickness because only the dermis and they will heal completely. Third degree, deep dermis or deeper. Massive discoloration, extraordinarily painful when it occurs. You don't have edema because everything is destroyed. The pain is intense and then it completely goes away. And sometimes people forget about it because the nerve endings are destroyed. And they do not heal without some type of additional treatment. And usually it means skin grafting or something like that. There's a big problem. Burns in people of color will often lead to depigmentation. So there are diseases where people lose areas of pigment without injury called vitiligo or leukoderma. Both names are used. Or, you may have heard of it, or you'll see it after a burn, well, depigment. The Steeler coach on the sideline, the running back coach who had that really bad problem, is still there. And you saw him, he became somewhat depigmented and a gentleman of color. So here you can see, first degree, typically you grab something hot by mistake. Fingertips now starting to blister. Nah, this is awful discoloration. It's almost like the fat's melting, becoming adherent to the skin. It's a good illustration. So, yeah, yeah, you don't want to be a physician or at an emergency room and not realize the criteria. The comment that I always make is this: when it's children, the criteria is a lot looser. Yeah, because it's not easy to treat children or babies with burns. So you don't have to go crazy. And basically a burn center referral, emergency room doc will get the nearest burn center on the horn and say, "Hey, I have an 8-year-old with blah 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 blah," and they'll say, "Yeah, send him over or send her over." So 25% of the body has sex. It's a quarter of, think of all the fluid that's leaking. 10% third degree burns. Anything on the extremities or genitalia, face, extremities, genitalia, boom, third degree burns, immediate referral. Whenever you treat a burn, same way we do at home, we debride. You can say debride or debride, doesn't matter. You get rid of the skin, you use something topical on it. It's the old story in life. Okay, I'll show it to you. Okay, don't ask me why I'm doing it because I like you. Huh. Easiest way for me to do this. I should have had a window open. Ignore me. Sorry, ignore me. Help, make me look good. Everything is so freaking slow today. All right, I'll have to spell it. I apologize. Okay. It's called Silvadene cream. It's the oldest story in the world. If there's one product that, if you have one product that's great, everybody uses it. It's been around forever. We're using a heavy metal compound in a particular cream called Silvadene cream. Okay. So if you look it up, that's what everybody puts on burns. Does it is take the place of oral antibiotics if they're needed? No. But it's great for avoiding secondary infections. Yes, we use temporary covering. Sometimes we have to use skin grafts. If it's severe, there's a variety of more modern agents that were used, different types of skin supplements. Here's the classic rule of nines chart. So the head basically has 4.5 in the front, 4.5 in the back. The upper extremities, each of them. So that makes, this is one, two, and three. 4.5 and 4.5. So it's 4.5 and 4.5 is 9, anterior and posterior. Upper extremities, including the hands, 4.5 and 4.5, another 9. The torso, the big player, 18 in the front. So there's an upper 9 and a lower 9. And on the back, a posterior 9 and both superior and inferior. So now you've got 1 9, 2 9s, 3 9s, 4 more, 7 9s. So we're doing pretty good here. That's where you get to 63. Go down here, 9 and 9. Okay? So you have 9 in the front on the thigh, 9 in the front on the thigh. And then, so you can think of this all as, so there's effectively 4 more. 9 in the front on the total extremity, 9 here, and then 9 more in the back, and that gives you the same total. So it could be 4.5 and 4.5, 4.5 and 4.5, and then think of the legs and the feet, 4.5 each way. So voila, anterior and posterior lower limbs, and one for the anogenital region, perineum. And that's that. So that's where we start with that. Now we're almost done, and I'm not obviously going to go as long, but I just want to show you where we're coming. It's going to start here, and hopefully I'll be able to. The dog's in the crate. Don't say anything. He's taking a nap. That's why he's not barking. I got to let him out. And so we're going to start with 6A, everybody. And then we're going to look at that. This is going to, and we're doing this from the lab perspective. So, really, what we look at here as we get into what it is and the distinctions and the cartilages. So, you'll see a little bit of this. Just introduce it. We'll talk about bone shed. What am I doing that for? Sorry. But really, not so much really the part that's really good is, I'll talk a little bit about that, is the markings. I'm trying to get their help, make it look good. Here we are. So from a lab perspective, this is what we looked at. We're going to classify bone marks. It's easier to do in the lab. I'll discuss them. We'll reinforce it next week in lab. Thank you very much. Have fun. We'll see you all soon. Appreciate you putting up with my less than happy voice. And if you have anything, just holler at me with a text or email. Thank you. Goodbye.